Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the special CNAS book event. I'm Richard Fontaine, CEO of the Center for New American Security. And it's a pleasure to discuss today the region everyone in Washington seems to talk about all the time, the Indo-Pacific. That region has become the primary focus of U.S. foreign policy, and of course is also that of our allies in Australia and Japan and partners like India. The pivot to Asia, announced with fanfare a decade ago, seems to be gathering steam today, and new initiatives like the Quad or the revitalized Quad, AUKUS, the administration's ambitions for some sort of an economic framework agreement and so on are rolling out. And the driving imperative behind so much of this is, of course, China, its combination of economic gravity, military might, its drive to extend its influence across the Indo-Pacific and beyond. So many in Washington and lots of other capitals as well are trying to figure out what to make of all this and what to do. And so to discuss what's to be done, I'm delighted today to welcome the man who literally wrote the book on the Indo-Pacific, and that is Rory Medcalf. His new book is Indo-Pacific Empire, China, America, and the Contest for the World's Pivotal Region. It's out in a new, did I just hold it upside down? There we go. So you can read it either way. That's the good thing about paper is that you can just turn it the right way. It's unlike cropping and things. Indo-Pacific Empire is out in a new edition, and Rory, who will be speaking with us today, has been the head of the National Security College at the Australian National University since 2015. He was the founding director of the Lowy Institute's International Security Program. In government, he worked as a senior strategic analyst with the Office of National Assessments and was an Australian diplomat. And although on my screen he looks just adjacent, he is dialing in from Australia right now. So I'm going to talk with Rory for about 20 minutes or so, and then we'll have an expert panel whom I'll introduce before they enter the discussion. But for now, Rory, welcome and congratulations on the new book, which I will hold right side up this time. It's quite timely, to say the least. Welcome.
Look, thank you very much, Richard. And it's great to be here. You know, I mean, I'm in Canberra and we're in the land down under, so I guess it doesn't really matter which way you pivot the cover. You know, I'm really pleased with the way you framed the introduction in a way, because I do think that, as we'll hear shortly, Australia has become front and centre, no longer the land down under, but front and centre of a lot of the strategic competition in the Indo-Pacific with global repercussions. And I'm really pleased that with a new edition of my book, which I've updated to cover the dramas and the traumas and the narrative of the last 2 years, I'm hoping we can explain, if you like, the origin story of where the Indo-Pacific came from, why it matters for our strategic choices.
That's exactly where I was hoping to start. So in the book, you say the Indo-Pacific is more than a descriptor of a particular part of the globe that happens to be bounded by two oceans. So what is it? What is the Indo-Pacific?
So look, the simple way I look at it is through two lenses. One is you can take a literal geographic descriptor, a framing of a region that is essentially a strategic system. And that means that the region that we once imagined as the Asia Pacific, and there is a huge Asian centrality to that story still, but that region is not just East Asia. It's a two-ocean system, the Indo-Pacific. And so the dynamics that matter to our national strategic choices, particularly in the security sense, but also in the geo-economic sense, not so much trade, but connectivity, infrastructure, and so forth, those are invariably a two-ocean framing the Pacific and the Indian Oceans. So there's a descriptive value to the Indo-Pacific, I think, but I'm also very interested in the second lens, which is a prescriptive value. It's the policy value. It's the use of the Indo-Pacific as a framework for strategic policy to deal with the big issue of our time, which is balancing China. It's managing the very disruptive impact of Chinese power. And in that second sense of the term of the Indo-Pacific, it's the foundation for a framework of building coalitions across a larger strategic space with a larger variety of partners than we could have imagined 20 years ago, 30 years ago in the Asia Pacific world.
And when we think of the Indo-Pacific, does it mean Asia Pacific plus India, or are there countries outside of Asia Pacific that you would include as we think conceptually about those coalitions? Are we trying to enlist Sri Lanka in a coalition? And, how do we think about that?
So, I mean, the simple explanation is simply this is the superficial explanation is that this is simply a plot to bring India into the strategic balance in what was the Asia Pacific. But of course, Asia Pacific thinkers would have always said, well, India may or may not be part of this system. India was kind of excluded, but not categorically excluded. So it's more sophisticated than that. Yes, it's about bringing India into the system, and yes, it's about recognising that there are power plays at work in the Indian Ocean too. But it's also, I think, frankly, about privileging the maritime and about recognising that the Indo-Pacific is a globally connected space. It's that contradiction in terms. It's a global region, and therefore the partnerships we're building are not only with resident or fully resident powers, but they're also with global stakeholders. I mean, every trading nation, every maritime nation has a stake in what happens in the Indo-Pacific as, in my view, China plays a bid for dominance.
No, I think that's a really good clarification there. I want to get in a minute to some of the prescriptive things that you talk about, but maybe before that, already in this conversation, we've started throwing around terms like strategic and frameworks and these things that have some meaning to the policy types, but seem kind of abstract. Maybe you could talk a little bit about how you see the stakes. I mean, what does an Indo-Pacific region dominated by China mean for the average Australian or the average American?
Well, firstly, I guess there's a huge debate about what dominance means, and if we had the time and space, I guess we'd have great conversations about primacy, preeminence, hegemony, all of those fancy words. But for the governments and the citizens in the region, it really is, I think, about national freedom of manoeuvre, national decision making. In the Australian experience, it really is ultimately about sovereignty. And so, there are some voices who say, look, if we live in a region dominated by China, it's not literally the end of the world. We'll find a way of coping. But I think what we've seen in Australia in the last 5 or 6 years has been this really profound wake-up call. We've had a taste of what the, coercive use of Chinese influence looks like in a middle power, in a developed country, in a nation that's not geographically at the absolute front line as Vietnam or India or Japan are. And yet we won't accept it. Our democratic system won't accept constraints on our political decision-making, economic coercion, interference in the diaspora communities or the politics of our internal affairs. And of course, the choices are much more unpleasant. The experience is much more unpleasant for smaller countries and countries that are, if you like, geographically even closer to China. So I think in the end, the choice that I put in the book, and it's not entirely original, I think it's the debate we're having very much at the heart of American policy today, is are we going to live in the most globally connected, globally pivotal region where, frankly, one authoritarian great power is imposing a veto over decision-making in a whole range of countries and choosing to use its influence when and how it sees fit? Or are we going to live in a region where there is some sort of genuine respect for the sovereign equality of nations, some sort of collective management of issues and tensions, and some sort of multipolarity, which, again, sorry to go back to the wonk speak, but is blended with the essentially the bipolar power play of the United States and China. At a policy level, those are the big issues. At a human level, I think it's going to be much more about, frankly, sovereign decision-making, particularly in democracies, as we see the impacts of the Belt and Road on decision-making in a whole lot of smaller countries around the region, and as we see the coercive use of military power in the South China Sea, across the Taiwan Strait, East China Sea, and so forth.
You talked about the wake-up call that Australia has had over the past few years, and of course, Australia is not alone in having something of a wake-up call. And there's something sort of mysterious, at least on surface, seems mysterious going on. I mean, Beijing has alienated Australia with its economic coercion, among other things. India with the border violence. Europe by putting sanctions on European politicians. The UK because of Hong Kong. Canada by taking hostages of Canadian nationals, and so on. And this seems counterproductive looking from the outside for China, because seems to be accelerating the formation of a coalition, at a minimum, skeptical of Chinese activity and intentions. So why are they doing this?
So we scratch our heads about this in Australia every day, and there's been a sea change in Australian perceptions of China over the past 5 to 6 years. The argument that is now accepted here is that China has changed. I mean, there was a debate in our politics that somehow we'd just been a little bit too rude, or a little bit too unpleasant, a little bit too, frankly, Australian, and therefore we had needlessly alienated China. But the reality is the awareness that China has changed, or maybe that some of the the perennial characteristics of the Leninist system of control had risen to the surface. I think the sense that I have sitting in Australia is that there's now a pretty inextricable dynamic between the extreme authoritarianism, or the frankly totalitarian cult of personality control that the current leadership in China is imposing domestically, with a more nationalist and assertive posture abroad, and that in fact they almost feel they can't let go of the tiger of the assertive posture abroad for fear of losing some degree of control domestically. So there is a kind of tragic dimension to this, but whether you think of it that way, or whether you think that there is in fact a much more calculated plan for regional hegemony, the effect is the same. It is that, at least for the moment, China seems to have trapped itself into this almost imperial, as the title of the book suggests, almost imperial phase of seeking to squash dissent, not only at home, but in other countries like Australia. And Australia is as others have said, the canary in the coal mine on this. Australia is a test case, because if differences can be crushed in Australia, in a middle power democracy, a developed multicultural democracy, whether it's differences in our diverse Chinese communities, whether it's open political debates and criticism of China's behaviour, whether it's our own independent diplomacy in the Indo-Pacific, or whether it's our alliance diplomacy with the United States, if one or more of those qualities of Australia can be neutralised by China, then frankly, it has set an example it can use elsewhere.
Right. And so that it's interesting that you say, well, whatever might be generating this pattern of activity, it's still an issue we have to contend with. What about the trajectory of Chinese power itself? So there's an increasing debate in Washington. I think the majority view is that China is rising, and it's a problem because it's increasing each year in power, economic power, military power, diplomatic, et cetera. But there's also an increasingly loud minority view that says, no, actually, China's dangerous, but not because it's rising, but because it's declining. Look at their demographic problems, the one-child policy overhang, environmental issues, the difficulties of social control. You can go on and on and on. So where do you come down on this? Is China a rising power or a declining power?
So look, I actually try to engage with this in the book through the lens of imperial histories in the Indo-Pacific, and I make the argument that there's always been, and I literally mean always been, a greater degree of connection between the Indian and the Pacific Oceans than I guess a lot of more recent history or policy has imagined. And this is a really important point to answer your question on China, because it means that all of the essentially imperial power plays in this region, going back literally two empires based in South Asia or Southeast Asia more than 2,000 years ago, or indeed Chinese imperial history, sooner or later, all of these empires have attempted to exert influence across the two-ocean space. And when they've done that, they've invariably found this is a region too large, too diverse, too complex, too messy for any one power to dominate. Now, you can ask the question whether China today is different. If you look at the use of technologies, it's able to achieve all sorts of control that previous empires could only have dreamed of. But the argument I still make in the book is that there is a kind of imperial overstretch on speed occurring across the Indo-Pacific. Look at China's ambitions in Africa, look at the untidiness of its involvement in Pakistan or elsewhere, for example, and that this is going to create a whole horizon of friction points where sooner or later the Chinese system is going to have to make some decisions about intervention, use of force, consequences it may not be able to control. That ties with the answer to your question to say that whether or not the Chinese project or the CCP project is sustainable, whether or not we've actually already passed the peak of China's relative power, there's going to be an increasingly difficult horizon of risk and decision for future Chinese leaderships to deal with. And if you combine that with the lack of a succession plan, all of the internal questions about demographics and debt and so forth, I think it does mean that democracies and others can and should hold the line, not patient in a passive sense, but to be strategically patient in a determined, confident sense. Time is not automatically on China's side. I guess that's where history brings me to in the end.
Well, let's get into some of the prescriptions that you offer. And I want to ask you a question about a broad one, actually, it's really less of a prescription and more of a desired end state. So in the book, you say the Indo-Pacific is a quote about incorporating a more powerful China into a regional order where the rights of others are respected and counterbalancing that power when those rights are not. The second part of that formulation, the counterbalancing that power when those rights are not, seems totally clear and potentially doable. Incorporating a more powerful China into a regional order where the rights of others are respected seems more or less at odds with your description of China as wanting dominance in the region and its activities. So is the first part of that, is there a conceivable regional order that China would enlist in that would respect the rights of others as we understand them?
Look, it depends which China we're talking about in many ways. And I guess that sentence is I guess perhaps too neat way of my attempting to come to terms with the dissonance of what's happened in the past 20 years. I mean, we remember the China of 15 years ago, and perhaps the first part of that formulation is reminiscent of where we hoped and imagined China would be 15 years ago, the responsible stakeholder, but perhaps a responsible stakeholder in a system that that a more reformist China would have a hand in creating. Is that now impossible to return to? It's very difficult to see how China can return to that. But I guess the argument I make is that while focusing on balancing and at times deterrence, we also have to look incrementally for those moments where we can try and encourage China in that other direction. And I think the big question that I don't have the answer to, and that I hope there are many China specialists in DC and elsewhere who are thinking very hard about, is where are the players or the voices in the Chinese system, however submerged, who in fact recognise the folly of what Xi Jinping's been doing for the past 8 or 9 years, and perhaps would think in those terms. So I guess I do include that slightly more hopeful formulation, but I've no doubt in my mind, and I think the new edition of the book and the section at the start that covers the past 2 years, I think emphasises this. I've no doubt in my mind that sadly, at the moment, the choices that China has made almost all point in that other direction, that direction that requires counterbalancing.
Yeah, that makes, unfortunately, it makes total sense. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how you see the vaunted, quote, mixture of cooperation and competition. I'm not quoting you, but I'm quoting what almost everyone who talks about China says, which is do not exclude the possibility of cooperation on areas of mutual interest. In the first edition of your book, you pose a hypothetical future pandemic as an opportunity, of all things, to forge cooperation with China, which would have seemed the most logical thing in the world. It's like the asteroid hitting the Earth. Neither the United States nor China have an interest in pandemic spreading. We both have an interest in it going away, of being contained. But of course, as we know, in the event, the opposite has been the case, and COVID hasn't attracted any U.S. competition or cooperation. It's just become another vector for competition. So does that tell you anything about the prospects for cooperation in other areas, or do you think that this searing example the past almost 2 years now is sort of limited and cabined to cooperation on this very visceral, domestically resonant issue of coronavirus?
No, look, I mean, obviously a very depressing example of how the black swan or the black elephant event of the pandemic has actually illustrated that prospects for cooperation are even worse than many of us imagined even just 2 or 3 years ago. Look, I think the point that I make in that part of the book, which I would still hold to, is that there will be times when objectively China needs us. It needs the United States, it needs democracies, it needs many other partners in the region. There are even times when China needs Australia, although they would prefer for us to think otherwise. Can we identify those moments, seize on them, and actually use them with agency to emphasise to China the need to back off on the confrontational aspects of its policy? I would have thought a pandemic would have been one of those moments. I think no one can predict quite the contours of the pandemic we've had or are having. That doesn't preclude other occasions in the future where China may need us, but ultimately it's about the leadership and the party's perception and its determination perhaps to refuse now that it needs to learn much that it can't frankly steal. So in that sense, I guess I'm more negative than I was a few years ago on that judgment, but I think hypothetically, we still should be looking for those opportunities to leverage China's need. The pandemic, though, has been a really troubling sign of an almost willingness by the regime to self-harm in order to maintain that, I wouldn't say even defiance, but maintain that resistance to any preferences of other countries.
I think as we look at the Biden administration's general approach to the Indo-Pacific, I think there's a lot of resonance between some of the things that you've articulated and kind of where they come from, the Indo-Pacific being sort of priority theater, the most important part of the world to the United States based on our own interests. China as the potential spoiler, if not worse in that region, the need to work more closely with allies and partners across the broad swath of the Indo-Pacific in order to bring together countries that can counterbalance on particular issues and so forth. So how does it look from Australia, since you speak for all Australians, of course? How does it look? How does it look from Canberra, the Biden administration's approach to the Indo-Pacific, and what do you make of AUKUS?
Okay, two big questions. Look, I certainly don't speak for all Australians. I do like to encourage a degree of bipartisanship in our politics on these issues, which has been reasonably strong in recent years, but we're about to enter an election season, so there's now a risk of that fraying. But what has fundamentally changed, as I said, is that recognition of the China challenge is now broadly held across the spectrum. Attitudes to the United States have gone through some really interesting, if you like, contours in recent years in Australia. No surprise or secret to talk about the anxiety with which the Trump administration was met in parts of the Australian community, but also at the same time there was, if you like, a pretty positive recognition among our security community and our foreign policy community that the United States was having its own reality check on China and that it was about time. So, we've been pleased to see, I think, the Biden administration not only pick up the Indo-Pacific framing of the strategic contest that people like Matt Pottinger under the Trump administration and others, and I, sort of would note Lisa, who we're going to be talking to in a moment, I believe would have had input into this as well. We've seen the Biden administration pick up that framing of strategic competition with China. I think that's actually quietly respected across much of the Australian policy spectrum. There's an appetite here to see the Biden administration really now flesh out its Indo-Pacific policy, including with the economic dimension. I think on free trade, Australia would still love to see the United States in a different place in the Indo-Pacific when it comes to regional free trade agreements, because these are now terrain for strategic competition with China. We're hearing a lot of the right things. We would like to see, I suspect, more weight to the military presence, not necessarily in numbers, but certainly in dispersion and firepower, and the ability to credibly compete with China in the conventional space. We're seeing these things, but we want to see more. And when you turn to AUKUS, which is, I think, in a way the most powerful symbol of and the most significant statement of the Biden administration's Indo-Pacific strategy and its commitment to Australia, the early signs are good from an Australian perspective. There was some discomfort here in the way the president perhaps moved so specifically to reassure our French friends in ways that looked a bit ambiguous to us. But fundamentally, we know that the settings are sound, and we know that the hard work with AUKUS, and that is not only nuclear-powered submarines for the Australian Navy, but just as importantly, the cooperation on critical technologies soon, I hope. We know that the hard work now lies with us and with the Brits as much as it does with the United States. And I guess the good news there, we saw an agreement signed just yesterday on nuclear naval propulsion among the three countries. The good news is that our system is really beginning to gear up on that.
Great. In just a moment, I'm going to invite in our panelists, and I would also invite the audience, if you've got questions, you may put them in the chat box here. A couple have already started doing that, so I'm going to give Rory one question from the audience to you, and then I'll introduce the panel, bring them in. So Dimitri Sevastopoulou from the Financial Times has a question for you. Do you think Australia would join a U.S.-China conflict over Taiwan, and how could the election next year change things?
So Dimitri, great question. Two great questions, of course. And interestingly, in a couple of hours from now, I'll be hosting a speech by our Shadow Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, where, according to media reports already in the Australian press today, she will, among other things, be talking about the positions of the two major parties in Australia on Taiwan. So I will choose my words carefully. But having said that, it depends what we mean by join. And I think the use of the word support a week or two ago in a comment by our Defence Minister, Peter Dutton, to say that he found it inconceivable that Australia would not support the United States in a Taiwan confrontation or conflict. I think support is the right word, because I don't think we need to prejudge exactly what that support looks like. It depends enormously, I think, on the specifics of the confrontation or the conflict in question. But look, I do think that it's very difficult to imagine that Australia would not support the United States in such a confrontation. Indeed, we are already involved through the intelligence relationship. We're already part of that, if you like, that operating system, to use Kurt Campbell's term. The specifics of it, though, would depend enormously on the situation. And I would argue that our system, our policy system, our security establishment needs to start thinking harder about how we support Taiwan in all of the circumstances short of war that Taiwan is enduring every day. How do we support a fellow democracy? How do we support an integral part of the Indo-Pacific and global economy from interference, from subversion, from coercion? That's how I'd see it. And to answer your second question, Could the election change things? I think not fundamentally. I think there is still, despite the heat and the noise that we're about to hear in the political debate, there is now broad bipartisanship in Australia on the China challenge and on the, I guess, the need for a balancing response and for the way the Biden administration is engaging. I don't believe that would fundamentally change if we had change of government.
Great. So let's bring in our panel. And before I introduce them, let me just remind the viewers that Indo-Pacific Empire, China, America, and the Contest for the World's Pivotal Region is available, I think, wherever fine books are sold. But if you buy it from Manchester University Press, there's a promo code MUP30. So, well, there it is on the screen. We're a full-service think tank, so there it is. And
thanks for the free advertisement. There we are.
and there you go. And I think they probably make great Christmas gifts and end of the year presents, et cetera. Okay, let's bring in the other speakers that we have to join us, and our expert panel. Who will be on the screen just momentarily include Lisa Curtis, who is Senior Fellow and Director of CNAS's Indo-Pacific Security Program. Dr. Michael Green, Senior Vice President for Asia and Japan Chair at CSIS and Director of Asian Studies at Georgetown University. And Dr. Thomas Wright, Director of the Center on the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institution. So thank you guys for joining us. And we'll have a conversation that includes all of us. And again, if folks in the audience have questions, and feel free to put them into the chat box here. So let me start with a big question. Maybe Mike, I can start with you, and then if others, Lisa or Tom or Rory, want to come in. When we think about the allied China policy, let's say the United States and Australia, what's the overall objective, or what should be the overall objective? Is it to change China's foreign policy behavior? Is it to change its domestic behavior? Is it to accept both as essentially unchanged, but will respond more effectively? Is it to overthrow the Chinese Communist Party and see democracy break out in China? And what is the long term? What should be the long term objective? What should we be aiming for? So, Mike, let me go to you.
Well, I think an honest answer to your question is that the Biden administration doesn't have an answer to that question yet. And I don't think the Trump administration had a consensus either. And that's because both administrations have been trying to, manage a Chinese foreign policy posture that's just much more coercive and aggressive under Xi Jinping, and has blown through all kinds of assumptions a lot of us had growing up in this business, including me and Rory. So they haven't answered that question even internally, I think. I think that Australia and Japan and some of our allies in the region are much closer to an answer. And Rory articulated it quite well a minute ago, which is it's hard to picture China bending back to the kind of, cooperation we hoped for 15 years ago when Bob Zoellick called for China to be a responsible stakeholder. Hard to see us bending the U.S.-China or Australia-China relationship back to that soon, but we shouldn't give up on that. And I think that's an important reference point for the administration here in Washington. Because if we, start choosing from your list, Richard, regime change, we're going to have a hard time coordinating strategy with our closest allies, including Australia and Japan. So I would go, if I were in the administration, I would put on a laminated card what Rory said earlier. I think that's a good answer. Bend us in the long run back to cooperation, but don't count on it.
Lisa or Tom, Lisa, do you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I would just say that we also should take note of the perceptions of other Indo-Pacific countries and what they're thinking about China, because we have seen polling that does tell us that negative opinions of China are going up, and they're going up in a lot of countries. So it is possible that China does come around at some point, recognizes the costs of its aggressive behavior, and starts to sort of gradually change course. I don't think it's something that would happen overnight, but it may sort of slowly sink in that they're not helping their case by continuing this kind of aggressive strategy on several different fronts at the same time.
Tom?
Yeah, Richard, I'll jump into just firstly, congratulations to Rory on the book. It's amazing that we do a paperback version couple of years after the first one comes out, and it holds up so well. So that's quite a feat. So well done. I guess my answer to the, people ask this question a lot, and I think they ask it not in the way you're asking it, Richard, but often it's asked in a way to discredit, great power competition or rivalry, or to try to say the US shouldn't really be competing with China. And, I think it's I'm not sure it's a question that needs an answer, but my answer, to it will be twofold. First, I think the objective is to preserve and uphold the regional order, in the Indo-Pacific against sort of Chinese revisionism. And secondly, I think it's over time, through a mixture of blunting and sort of pushing back, to create the space where some type of détente may be possible. I wouldn't go quite as far as Mike, and I think with Xi Jinping in particular, I think there's no prospect of a return to sort of the Zelig concept. But I do think, there are different modes of rivalry and competition. And in the Cold War, there was different phases. This is not the Cold War, but there may be different phases too. So we could get to a more positive phase with a little bit more structured cooperation if our expectations are modest, but there's a long way to go between here and there.
Tom, let me just come back to you with another question. Then I'd love to get Rory in and others in on this, and that is Europe. As we all are vividly aware, some European countries, including France, are resident powers in the Indo-Pacific, and certainly think of themselves that way, and would like it if others do. There's something of a quiet debate, I guess, between saying it's great for the UK to send a carrier in the Indo-Pacific, it's great for the French to do FONOPS, it's great for the Germans to have some fairly modest but nevertheless real military deployment in the Indo-Pacific. We should welcome that. We should get them sort of more anchored in the Indo-Pacific. The other is, no, that's going to mean virtually nothing for the Indo-Pacific balance of power, the military balance there. They would do best by focusing on their own neighborhood, Europe first, Middle East second, let the US with all of its capability deal with Indo-Pacific and this sort of regional sheriff's division of labor kind of thing. And where do you, Tom, come down on that? And then I'd love to go to Rory and anyone else who wants to come in.
Yeah, I guess I'm in a third position. I think I'll come back to the first one first. I think the second position doesn't work. Like the idea that the US can basically pull out of Europe, or sort of the Josh Hawley position that Europe should just deal with Russia, deal with North Africa and the Middle East. I don't think they're capable of doing that sort of independently. As you know, it will create real ructions in Eastern and Central Europe. I think the US has a very important role to play there, needs to be deeply engaged in the region. But at the same time, I think that the first position, which is, it's all about cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, is really a distraction from the primary challenge here, which is Europe needs to get ready in Europe to be more resilient vis-a-vis China, right? So as the US is deeply engaged to deter Russia, deeply engaged in upholding a European regional order, they need to do a lot more, continuous with what they've been doing to date, really, to be stronger, to act with one voice vis-a-vis Beijing. A part of that is the Indo-Pacific, but I think it's a very small part of the broader sort of challenge, which is largely, technological, economic, diplomatic, counter-coercion. So I think it is about China, but not necessarily in the Indo-Pacific when it comes to transatlantic cooperation.
Rory, I see you nodding.
Yeah, look, I will jump in, and I like Tom's third position, and I would add to that it's a bit of a false binary to say to our European friends, look, either we see your navies here or you're not playing in the Indo-Pacific strategic contest. Actually, a lot of the value that European powers can add in the Indo-Pacific, frankly, in balancing China and in diluting Chinese power and in supporting, if you like, the frontline states here, is not going to be ships in the water, much as it's good to see some of that, particularly the British carrier strike group this year. It's going to be those areas where Europe is and has been strong and respected by ASEAN, for example, areas to do with rule of law, with governance, with infrastructure development and so forth. Europe with Japan, really important player here. Europe with Australia, Europe with the United States, indeed Europe with India in cases in the Indian Ocean, for example, should be one of the centres of power, whether collectively as the EU or individual European states, and of course Britain really has opportunities here too, in providing alternatives to the Belt and Road for development and infrastructure and technology in the many, many powers that are the swing states in the Indo-Pacific and Southeast Asia, the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. That's just as important to me as the ships in the water.
Lisa and Mike, maybe just to expand on the question a little bit. So it seems to me that Europe's economic role in the competition with China is sort of gigantically important. And I wonder, however logical, not that you would advocate this, but those who are making the argument of the sort of regional sheriffs, if we said, for example, to the Brits, like, yeah, go put that carrier back in the Med because, you know, it's a nice try, but it's more valuable there, and said to the French, like, you know, keep that stuff in near metropolitan France and things like that. Can you segment the Paul Mill side from the economic side, which seems to be going in the opposite direction that we want, that people start to see the Chinese competition as one that takes place across multiple sectors and joins us on various issues. But Lisa, and then maybe Mike, what's your view on Europe's role here?
Yeah, I don't think we need to think about this as segmenting the European or UK role. Certainly, the Europeans have a role to play in the Indo-Pacific and meeting the challenges that China brings. And, you know, it doesn't have to be military. If it is, great. You know, if the French are exercising in the Indo-Pacific, great. If we're doing joint sales, that's great. What, the UK has done in sending their strike carrier, that's great too. But what we really need is the values piece. This is what the Europeans can bring. They bring support for democracy, technical assistance to support civil societies with free media, and all of that kind of thing that we definitely need. And I think the EU strategy toward the Indo-Pacific was quite good. And it did capitalize on the strengths that they can bring, not only democracy, human rights support, but on promoting free and transparent and open trade, regulatory issues on the technology front, digital connectivity. There's so much that the European countries have to bring to this endeavor. And it would be ludicrous for the U.S. to say, no, you just, focus on other things, focus on Russia. That would be ridiculous because the Europeans have a lot to bring and they want to be involved in this part of the world. And if it's not in the military space, that's fine. They can bring what they can bring. And certainly the U.S. should be welcoming this, and we can complement each other's efforts. I think that's really important. That I think the EU wants to have its own strategy, clearly. They don't want to just be part of a U.S. strategy. Okay, fine. But we can still complement each other in what we're doing and work in tandem, because I think when it comes down to it, we both have the same visions for where we want to see the region going.
Yeah, I think in some ways the most important aspect of the QE2 carrier strike group deploying to the Indo-Pacific or the French frigates in the South Pacific are not that, we can now plan them into our, plans for defending Taiwan or Japan or something like that. It's that it shows willpower and resolve. And it shows that Paris and London are not afraid to show the flag, and they're not afraid of upsetting Beijing. That to me is the most valuable part of this, because for 20 plus years, the Chinese view of the world in official documents and scholarly documents has been that it's a multipolar world. China's the Asian pole, we're the North American pole, Europe is a sort of wobbly, confused pole, and that China can divide these poles. And that in a crisis over the South China Sea, the East China Sea, Taiwan, that Europe can be neutralized. And the economic consequences and geopolitical consequences can be managed if China uses force. I think what this shows is that China can't count on that Europe does have a fundamental interest in common with the US and Australia and Japan against the use of coercive force to change borders or to resolve issues. And that signal is very, very important. And, I agree with Tom that under Xi Jinping, we're not going to bend China back to anything like responsible stakeholders. This is a generational challenge. But one of the first things we have to do is disabuse Beijing of some of its assumptions about how the international system is set up and demonstrate that there is transatlantic solidarity, just as there is solidarity among allies in Asia. We may have different approaches, but if China crosses certain lines, they're going to find we're much more united than China previously thought. That's the value of Royal Navy flags and French Navy flags in the Western Pacific, to me.
Mike, let me follow up with you on another question. So Rory alluded to Australia's essentially standing up for its sovereignty and independence in the face of Chinese economic coercion, which is made news all over the world, and I think is frankly inspiring. And we're lucky that Australia was the canary. It was an Australian canary in the coal mine. But that gets to my point. There's only one Australia, and it's not clear that other countries in the region, when faced with the same volume of coercion and direction, would respond similarly. When you get into the what should we do about it, the answer right now to any Asia expert on what should we do about it is have a trade policy, get back into CPTPP, digital economy agreement. If you can't do that, stipulated. Those are good things to do. But even if the United States was in TPP yesterday or had never gotten out, it's only going to have a modest role in diminishing the dependence on China, capital, export market, so forth, of the countries in the region, just by virtue of the size of its economy, the geography, the demography. So how should the United States and Australia and other countries deal with China's economic gravity and the leverage that goes along with it, given some of the economic realities that don't appear to be terribly shiftable?
Well, CPTPP was negotiated I strongly support it, as does everyone on the screen, but it was negotiated in a different context. And a lot of it was about tariffs and state-owned enterprise disciplines in China and things that are now very, 2010. And that's why I think digital trade, and specifically a digital trade agreement, is the kind of step that will fill that gap, because then you're talking about, 21st century cutting edge technological questions. And it's interesting that Gina Raimondo, the Commerce Secretary, and others are talking about 5G cooperation, supply chain management, digital trade. These are all the right issues. If the administration, with Australia at the center, with Japan, Korea, I think, frankly, only a few European countries matter up front to some of these technologies. If we can actually start organizing digital trade agreements and rules and setting up standards for 5G, that has an enormous impact. It, for one thing, will give comfort to countries that come under coercion from China. It will set an example for countries to follow elsewhere who will aspire to be in these agreements. I think it really takes the momentum away. Part of the problem with us not being in TPP is that the narratives and image matter, and right now we are not on the field, and there are questions about whether we're going to be engaged in rulemaking. So I think we can fill that space. I think there are allies who would step right in with us to do it. And the only puzzle to me is why the administration is so afraid of these issues. And I think it's honestly, Richard, because the politics within the Democratic Party are right now not favorable to a digital trade agreement, because the left wants to go after Facebook, basically. Wants to go after Facebook, and that would be a huge distraction. Until we sort out our own politics internally, we'll be handicapping ourselves. But I think, into next year, we will be in a better position, and the administration will be in a better position to start getting traction.
Rory?
Yeah, look, I take a little bit of heart from that, but I'd also note that we haven't mentioned the Quad yet in this conversation, and I can't let it pass that we've done some excellent collaboration with CNAS on the Quad Tech Network, on building a lot of the intellectual capital and the ideas factory that, frankly, Quad leaders drew on in their summit recently in Washington. And the point of that is that the Quad is one of those examples where four countries that once we would have said are unlikely to be together, the leaders on framing technology standards or on identifying how we can build alternative supply chains, are now putting those issues front and center competition for influence with China in the Indo-Pacific, and it doesn't need to stop with the Quad, and it won't. Quad plus, particularly European powers, coordination with the Five Eyes. The limit really there is the determination of our governments to bring the private sector on board. But I think the public appetite is there in ways that simply weren't a few years ago.
Lisa, the Quad came up, so I'm going to you. Actually, it was the next question. So you very brilliantly anticipated my next question. Rory, so on the Quad, it's hard almost to remember that 10 months ago, the Quad leaders had never, ever met as a group. And now it just seems entirely natural that 4 leading Indo-Pacific democracies would meet and coordinate. And of course, you've got the Quad Tech Working Group and the Quad Vaccine Initiative and other things. What do you see as the sort of, I guess, medium to long-term potential of the Quad? I mean, could it become an alliance in all but name one day? Could it do much more together militarily or economically, for that matter? What do you see as the potential of the Quad? Lisa, that was to you.
That was to me. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, and just a nod to Rory and the ANU for leading on the Quad Tech network work. And I think you're right. I think it has informed the way the official Quad talks have moved forward on the technology piece. And you can see that in the joint statement that came out after the September 24th Quad Summit, and a lot of talk about Open RAN, open radio access networks, and how the Quad can work together on those. So great work on that. And as far as the Quad's future, obviously it's focused on non-military issues explicitly, focusing on vaccines, climate technologies, and emerging and critical technologies, but also infrastructure, looking at post-pandemic economic recovery in Southeast Asia. And if you read the joint statement, it mentions all these things, plus Burma, plus Afghanistan, really touches on most every issue, not Taiwan yet, but most other strategic issues. So even if it's a non-military grouping, it's a strategic grouping. And certainly security issues are on the minds of all 4 nations. And so the way I look at it is the grouping is building habits of cooperation. They're cooperating on strategic issues. And should the need arise to have a more formal military role, they could quickly transition into that role. And it really depends on China, I would say, and its role moving forward. But clearly, right now, the focus is non-military. It's on economics, technology, but these are not the soft issues that you might previously think of them. They're actually very strategic issues, because part of the play by China is to try to dominate critical and emerging technologies and try to have a dominant footprint in the digital space in Southeast Asia. So in fact, these are very strategic issues that the 4 countries are cooperating on. But for the time being, I think, AUKUS is playing that military role. That's clearly a military agreement between the 3 countries. But the Quad, I think everybody is satisfied to see it focused on non-military issues until China might make it necessary to do otherwise.
There's a question from someone in the audience. This is from David. Given that the nuclear power submarines are 2 decades away from being delivered to Australia, has the AUKUS declaration strategic effect been diluted? So the question is about teasing out short and medium-term strategic benefits of AUKUS.
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, I think this is, as I understand it, not being sort of an expert in all details of everything in the AUKUS agreement. I mean, this is something that's going to be addressed right in the 18-month sort of discussion, including with some options for sort of filling that gap. And the gap is maybe a little bit longer than was the case with the French submarines, but there was still obviously a gap with the French submarines too. I think they were coming on with the 2030, 2031. These are, 2035. I might have those sort of details wrong. Someone will correct me, but there was always a gap. I think the US has options, of course, to try to fill that, whether it's leasing or something else. I think the broader point, though, is that this does sort of change the strategic balance, I think, even in the medium term, because it does sort of signal that the US and Australia and the UK are going to be working incredibly closely, together on all manner of things, in the Indo-Pacific, not just in the submarine, piece of it. And it is, of course, a reaffirmation of that US commitment. And yes, there were problems with France, but with the diplomacy we've seen since, I think we're likely to see, continued European engagement there as well. So I think actually the Allies come very strongly out of this. I thought it was a terrific, agreement. And what I liked about it was the fact that it was sort of taking the initiative, getting on the front foot, doing something a little bit surprising. And I think that's sort of often what's missing a little bit when we think about, US strategy. It's often just path dependence of what went before. And we've seen in the Trump administration, of course, innovation on the Quad side that was continued. This, I think, is another manifestation of that. So I think that, while details in diplomacy, can be debated and shortcomings of it need to be addressed, I think that mindset is actually a healthy sort of mindset in terms of, calling the big plays and trying to put points on the board.
Rory, Scott Malcolmson has put in a question here about how the emergence of the Indo-Pacific might affect the importance or shape the activities of the Five Eyes. So maybe you can answer that. And then if you have anything to add to the point that Tom was raising on the UK's role in the Indo-Pacific.
Yeah, look, I'll weave Five Eyes and AUKUS together, which kind of makes sense. I mean, look, firstly on AUKUS, look, the fact that, presumably the nuclear-powered submarines that I think Australia needs are not going to be in service, in operation with the Australian Navy for many years. That's no secret or mystery or surprise. That wasn't an idea that arose after the announcement of AUKUS. We knew all along that would be the case, but the strategic choice of going with AUKUS is partly a recognition that, frankly, the contest for the Indo-Pacific or the risks in this region are not going to be over 5, 10, 15 years from now. This is really about setting up Australia to protect its interests and contribute to alliances and coalitions, well into the future. So it's actually taking a very long view. There's lots that AUKUS can do in the meantime. And that's where I think just as importantly as gearing up our establishments to proceed with the nuclear submarine option, I think the critical technology cooperation under AUKUS, I'd love to see some early outcomes in areas like artificial intelligence, for example, among the security and industry establishments of the three countries. That's where we've frankly got a blank canvas now for us, the three countries, to work together and I believe deliver some results. And that does tie in with Five Eyes and other avenues of cooperation. I'm one of those who has the view that just because we've got enormous levels of trust in the Five Eyes on intelligence does not mean we can't translate that trust into practical policy cooperation on technology and security and geoeconomics. And it can be Five Eyes plus in the Indo-Pacific context. So working with the Japanese and others. I don't think there's a contradiction between Australia working with Five Eyes partners singly or in groups or whatever as the case may be under AUKUS, and working with Asian partners. And there is a bit of a false debate being set up at the moment that having gone with AUKUS, we've somehow turned our back on Asia, which I think when you look at the Quad, is absolute nonsense. The last point I might just add, if I can, Richard, is actually about AUKUS in France, because I didn't articulate this earlier, and it is important. Australia's got a challenging path ahead in our relationship with France and the Indo-Pacific as a consequence of moving away from the conventional submarine contract we had with the French. This points to a tension within the Indo-Pacific family, if you like, sort of a family feud in the Indo-Pacific that we all need to grow out of as quickly as we can. because at the moment, some of our French colleagues, at least at a diplomatic and political level, are essentially saying to the region, look, you can either choose between an American-led, somewhat confrontational approach with China, or you can choose our middle way, our diplomatic middle way. Well, the fact is, France, until a few months ago, was all intent on helping Australia build its deterrent capability, or at least that was, what it appeared to be on the surface. So, in fact, I think, privately, the French recognise that there is a security contest in the Indo-Pacific. And so now in the new circumstances of AUKUS, we need to find other common ground with the French and European powers to demonstrate that, yes, we'll pursue diplomatic pathways in the Indo-Pacific, but sooner or later, there could well be moments where our European friends have to choose. I'll leave it there.
Lisa, let me go to you with another question from someone in the audience. This is from Shoba, who says India is one of the key strategic partners in naval exercises and the rules-based functioning of the Indo-Pacific region. What if we slap CATSA sanctions on them? Would they not empower China if one of our key partners is sanctioned within the coalition?
Well, the CATSA question has been out there for several years now. And now that it looks like India is getting pretty close to taking delivery of the S-400s from Russia, which would be at the point that would trigger the CATSA sanctions, things do seem to be coming to a head about what the administration will do. However, I would say that the Republicans, led by Senator Cruz, recently introduced legislation that would waive any CATSA sanctions on Quad countries that were, working closely with the U.S. On Quad activities. So obviously that would exempt India, or would allow India a waiver. So that's important because it sends a signal that you're not going to, if the administration was to exercise waiver authority, or at least partial waiver authority with India, if it takes delivery of the S-400s, that you wouldn't get a lot of pushback from the Republican side of the aisle. Now, there still may be some congressional members that would oppose this, but I think that was a very important signal to the administration about, what decision they'll make. And I think if you look closely at some of the statements that we've seen coming out of the administration, there is a sense that they are weighing more heavily the importance of the U.S.-India strategic relationship and are sounding more sympathetic to India's arguments for why it needs the S-400. China, of course, has it. So I think we can see some of the statements coming out of this administration, this Biden administration, to be a bit more sympathetic, I think, toward India's position, India's defense needs. Now, that said, I think we would need a demonstration from India that over the longer term, it is moving away from purchasing Russia military items. I think they still rely 65 to 70% of their military purchases are from Russia. So they need to be moving away clearly from that overall trend and demonstrating that they do see other partners, namely the U.S., as the future of their military modernization efforts. So I think I'll just leave it at that, but that's where I see the CATSA issue standing at the moment.
Does anybody want to make a case for sanctioning the Indians if they buy the S-400? No? Okay. Let me go, and Mike, I'll pitch this to you, but I think probably everyone will have some view on this. So in Rory's book, he writes of the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act, and he calls it one of the most far-reaching pieces of industrial legislation in U.S. history. Commits about $250 billion for R&D, manufacturing, semiconductors, emerging technologies. It's an act of geoeconomic rearmament, is how Rory puts it. You know, lots of domestic policies now and domestic imperatives are getting classed under this umbrella. We need to do this in order to compete more effectively with China, from education to industrial policy to you can name it. So Mike, let me go to you. I mean, you at least worked in Republican administration, and, you know, industrial policy used to not be popular. But now we see on the Hill lots of enthusiasm where it didn't exist before. Do you think that an effort like this, maybe not this particular piece of legislation, is a proper response to the China challenge? Does the United States need a big industrial policy in order to compete effectively with China?
Well, you know, Richard, like you, and maybe Lisa too, I went to CSIS and I was trained in neoclassical economics and taught to spit whenever I said industrial policy, and then did my PhD on industrial policy, actually. But the interesting thing is, you know, the original co-sponsor of the CHIPS Act, the first version of this legislation, Senator Todd Young from Indiana, his bill was endorsed by the Venture Capital Association because they said we cannot raise enough capital on the free market to do what has to be done for AI, to be competitive in AI. So we're in a new, not a space race, something a bit different, but we're in a new scale that requires that kind of industrial policy, and particularly because we're competing with a major state-centered competitor, adversary in China. And so I think it makes a lot of sense. What we have to be really careful about is this sort of contradictory trend, which is in the Biden White House technology competition statement from last summer, which says we're going to work with allies and partners, you know, as we build this competitive framework on AI and so forth. And oh, by the way, we're going to have a Buy America policy. And those are fundamentally contradictory, and they have not to this date resolved them. I'm hopeful that, I know for Republicans on the Hill, they want some key allies, Japan, Australia, Korea, the Netherlands, who are critical for AI and semiconductor fabrication, to be investing in the US, to be part of a trusted pool. We have got to work out, we can't have it both ways. We can't have that we're going to work with allies and partners and, oh, by the way, buy American. But I'm reasonably confident that the people behind this kind of legislation are going to emphasize that, some core allies going forward. But it'll be a bit of a fight. We have to keep an eye on it.
Tom or Lisa or Rory, do any of you want to come in on this? Yeah, Rory?
Oh, no, look, just to add from an Australian perspective, and I think, you know, I partly chose to focus Australian minds on what's changing in the United States and the challenges you've got ahead as well. No question of that. But, you know, there's still a sense in parts of the Australian debate that, you know, US is in this state of terminal decline and dysfunction and so forth. And I just wanted to emphasize to some of our readers in Australia that it's a bit more complicated than that. And I do think the post-COVID setting, certainly in the Australian context, has a really big impact here, because, you know, industrial policy in this country has often had the same stigma attached as in other, you know, many other liberal democracies over the past 20 or 30 years, especially in the United States. That is changing. And I turn back to AUKUS. You know, AUKUS is going to be a nation-building activity in Australia. This will only work if we can mobilise in the way we did in the 1950s with what was known as the Snowy Mountains hydroelectric scheme, you know, that was about post-war reconstruction and national development and migration in Australia. We're going to need universities, industry, government, and the alliance all working together. And that does require a national mindset change. And we're beginning to see the first glimmers of it here in Australia. You know, universities that are often not the most popular parts of the national security apparatus in Australia. They don't tend to see themselves as part of the national security effort. Universities are suddenly lining up to say, AUKUS, you know, education in the nuclear sciences, how can we help? So that's a good sign.
Okay, we have time for one last question. Rory, I'm going to pitch this directly to you because it's about your book. So in the new edition, you've updated the title of the book from Contest for the Indo-Pacific to Indo-Pacific Empire. That part is less interesting to me than the subtitle, which you've changed. So the previous subtitle was Why China Won't Map the Future. And that was a pretty declaratory, China won't map the future. Now it's China, America, and the contest for the world's pivotal region, which leaves me feeling a lot less reassured than your first edition. So why did you change the subtitle, and what should we read into that changing assessment, if anything?
Look, don't read too much into the marketing games of publishers there, Richard. Just to be clear to our audience, the original edition was an Australian-only publication. So Contest of the Indo-Pacific was an Australian edition, and the Australian publisher liked this title, Why China Won't Map the Future. I still stand by the argument that China alone will not, if you like, call the shots in the Indo-Pacific. It was really an argument to say that the rest of us middle powers have agency too. For their own reasons, the international publisher preferred this title, and perhaps they wanted the word America in there. I don't know, but I really liked the theme of the ambiguity of the theme of empire, because frankly, the Indo-Pacific Empire in this morality play is China, but it's an empire on speed with a bit of, if you like, automaticity to it that's actually going to make its own life very, very difficult. I haven't become that much more gloomy about the scope for balancing China. However, the contours of the contest have become much sharper in the past 2 years.
So I think Rory's real message is, if you're confused by both editions, you'll have all bases covered. All right. Well, thank you so much, Rory, for talking with us about your book, Indo-Pacific Empire. Lisa, Curtis, Tom Wright, Mike Green, thank you for joining us, and for everyone who tuned in for this. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for being with us this afternoon, and on to the next book. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.